Hi there, John Wilkinson and History Made Easier. Having looked at Hitler's management of World War II, I thought I should balance the books, as it were, and take a look at Stalin's management of the war. And in this video, I'm going to focus on Stalin's preparations for war. The good points, the positive points, but also the problems surrounding that preparation, or lack of. Economic preparation, a positive spin. At the beginning of the 1930s, the Soviet Union was producing more aircraft and tanks than anyone else. The focus on military expenditure had actually fallen during the first five-year plan, 1928 to 1932, but this had focused on heavy industry that would later benefit production for the military, which was a main focus for the second five-year plan that ran from 1933 to 1937. Also, military production was deliberately located on the eastern side of the Urals, away from German bombers and still out of reach of Japanese bombers. What is more, the Soviet Union, much more so than Germany, was also self-reliant with regard to raw materials. But, despite the determination to use the time bought by the Nazi-Soviet pact to prepare for what seemed an inevitable war, Stalin remained so worried that on November the 7th, 1940, after a long dinner which included heavy drinking to celebrate the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalin left his guests with a somber warning. "History has spoiled us," he told them. "We have had many successes with comparative ease. This has led to complacency in many of us, a dangerous complacency. We are not prepared for the sort of air war being waged between Germany and England. It turns out that our aircraft can stay aloft for only 35 minutes, while German and English aircraft can stay up to several hours. If in the future our armed forces, transport and so forth are not equal to the forces of our enemies, then they will devour us." The state of the army, a positive spin. The Soviet army was increased during the second five-year plan, 33 to 37, increasing from 600,000 to 940,000 in 1934 and to 1.3 million in 1935, with a reserve in the militia twice that size. Its officers studied and applied the techniques that were being considered in the West: mechanized units, the combination of air power and ground troops, paratroopers, chemical warfare, and the use of bomber planes. But the Red Army had, as Jeffrey Hosking described it, a paradoxical and sometimes tense relationship with the state from which it was born. It was a key institution of the state. The values of the state and the army were one and the same, and the army had defended the revolution in the Civil War. But it was made up of, at the top end, the old military elite that had served the Tsar before the revolution, and in its rank and file, mostly made up of peasants. Well, they were at the best indifferent, and at the worst, hostile to the revolution. So it was that the party felt it necessary to keep a careful watch on the army through the political commissars. Apart from the often tense relationship between commander and political commissar, this culture of being watched, being controlled by the party, led to a lack of individual initiative, weakening the ability of commanders to respond to the unexpected. This was shown in the Winter War and even more so when the Nazis invaded in 1941. But before that, in 1937, came Stalin's purge of the armed forces, and there were no half measures. It was claimed that a gigantic conspiracy had been uncovered with Marshal Tukhachevsky, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and Deputy Commissar for Defence, Marshal Egorov, Chief of the General Staff, and 6 other generals, all of them heroes of the Civil War, at the centre of it. They were charged with treason, accused of spying for Germany and Japan. Some of the evidence was supplied on request by German intelligence. Handy for Germany, that. They were put on trial, a one-day tribunal, found guilty and shot early the following morning. In a little over a week, a further 980 senior officers and political commissars were arrested in connection with the conspiracy. Over the next 18 months, all 3 branches of the armed forces were ruthlessly purged. When it had finished, all 11 war commissars were dismissed. 3 of the 5 army's marshals were also dismissed. 14 out of 16 of its commanders, and more than 2/3 of the 280 divisional commanders too, and half of the commissioned officer corps, 35,000 officers in total, as well as more than 60% of the political commissars were purged, of whom more than 7,000 were arrested and either imprisoned or shot. And 75 of the 80-man strong military council were also executed. Orlov, the commander of the Navy, and all serving admirals of the fleet were shot, and thousands of naval officers were sent to labour camps. The Soviet Air Force was dealt with in the same manner, only 1 senior commander surviving the purge. Not even the military intelligence service was spared. One immediate effect was the disbandment of the 7 mechanized corps, as well as the Soviet Union's lead in developing the most powerful strategic bomber force in existence. Marshal Tukhachevsky had been laying the groundwork for a new type of warfare, armoured and motorised units supporting infantry with air support too. But this was now lost. Apart from those who had paid with their lives, the designer of the new fighter aircraft, Andrei Topolov, for example, was in a labour camp. Another immediate effect was seen in the thinking and the policies of both Stalin and Hitler. For Stalin, it was a factor in deciding to opt for a pact with the Nazis in 1939, rather than an alliance with Britain and France. They would most likely want him to fight a war. A deal with Hitler would at least buy him time. Whereas for Hitler, in 1941, having avoided the dreaded two-front war in 1939, or so he thought, felt that a weakened Soviet army could be defeated in a single campaign. Unprepared. The effect of the purge on the efficiency of the Red Army was shown in the Winter War of 1939-40 against Finland, in which the army performed badly. But a much more important consequence was that when Operation Barbarossa got underway, around 75% of the Red Army's officers had been in post for less than a year. Morale wasn't high either, as many of the peasant conscripts resented Stalin's collectivization program, and there were discipline problems, which led to a severe disciplinary code being introduced in 1940. The partition of Poland and the acquisition of the Baltic states didn't help either. For as the frontiers moved westwards, new defences needed to be built, and these would be harder to defend, and in any case were still being prepared when the Germans attacked. What is more, Stalin had already moved the artillery from the old positions, despite Generals Timoshenko and Shaposhnikov advising him not to. The abandonment of Marshal Tukhachevsky's plans had left the Soviet Union weakened too. A report from a special commission set up by the party's Central Committee spelt out the problem. There are no agreed opinions on the utilization of tanks, aviation and parachute troops. The development of tanks and mechanized forces lags behind contemporary requirements. The ratio of mechanized forces is low and the quality of Red Army tanks unsatisfactory. Similar mistakes were made with regard to the Soviet Union's air defences, which did much to undermine the advantage the Soviet Union had in the number of planes they had. A plan to build 190 new airfields in the western regions had been approved in February 1941, and at the same time, work began enlarging the old ones. As a result, though, most planes had to be moved to civilian airports, most of which were positioned near the borders and so quickly overrun, and were without the normal air defences. Other problems would arise as a result of the poor state of the Red Army's communication systems and a lack of motorised vehicles. What was more, despite developing excellent new weaponry, including new tanks, fighter planes, bombers, and even a multiple rocket launcher, they failed to put them into mass production. And as 1940 came to an end, the Red Army's senior military commanders met to review the lessons to be learned from both the Winter War and Germany's Blitzkrieg. They also played out a war game using large-scale maps to play out two possible attack options that the Germans might deploy and how they could be defended against. In mid-January, Stalin called his senior commanders to the Kremlin, and the dispute over tanks was embarrassingly played out all over again in front of him. Though only a year before, in November 1939, Stalin had agreed to the disbandment of all tank army groups in favour of cavalry. Now he sided in favour of tanks, and the reformation of mechanised corps began in March. And in the first 6 months of 1941, over 1,000 T-34 tanks, an outstanding tank, fast and with a big gun, were belatedly produced. However, there is a but. Instead of forming self-sufficient armoured units as the Germans had done so successfully, the Soviet tanks were put into existing units and mixed with older, really obsolescent tanks. For example, only platoon commanders' tanks had radios. Also, commanders and tank drivers received minimal training. Few tank drivers had more than an hour's practice. 2 decisions made and 2 not made. 2 decisions were made and 2 not made that were to have a profound effect on what unfolded in June. The war games in December were played out on the assumption that the German main attack would be on the Western Front, aimed at Minsk, Smolensk and Moscow. But Stalin disagreed and ordered the Soviets' defences to be made strongest on the southwestern front, where the grain of the Ukraine and the coal of the Donbass would be the prize. Stalin was also convinced that the Germans would only be able to open their attack with limited forces. And it was this misjudgment that led to the second calamitous decision. Stalin refused to sanction the dispersal of reserves of food, fuel, and raw materials behind the Volga, out of reach of the Germans. They were either left where they were, to the west of the river, or else actually moved forward to advanced positions. The decisions that were not made were equally significant. The first, with German forces clearly forming on the frontier, Stalin ignored a proposal from his chief of staff to seize the initiative and launch a surprise attack on them. What was worse, no operational plans were issued, so that when the Germans did attack, the Soviet response followed no predetermined plan, because one didn't exist. Viktor Kravchenko, an official of the Ferrous Metals Commissariat, offers a very useful insight. This is what he said. I was in daily official touch with commissariats responsible for factories and stockpiles and workers in the area under attack. It soon became apparent to us that no one in the Kremlin had bothered in the 22 months of grace, the period that the Nazi-Soviet pact had held, to formulate a program for the evacuation of people and property. The initiative, of course, could only have come from the top. For anyone else to raise the question would have opened him to charges of defeatism and demoralising rumours. Faced with a defensive war of immense weight, we were helpless. We had to improvise everything from scratch: evacuation, mobilisation, guerrilla resistance in the enemy's rear. Everything. So there's Stalin's preparations for war. And I think if you put it alongside the section in my video on fatal choices that covers Stalin's decision to ignore that Germany was about to invade, I think you can see why Germany got off to a good start when it did invade the Soviet Union. The second video will cover Stalin's management of the war itself. But for now, as always, I thank you for listening. Cheers.